Hello, welcome to Miniature Realms. My name's Stuart and thank you to the third video based on the new Breaching of the Great Bastion release. I've already covered the new Arcane Journal in a review. You can catch that video here, and a big unboxing and painting of all of the normal troops. Well, not all of them, but I painted some of each to show you how I went about doing it. And this video is time to turn the attention to the Astromancers.
Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Counter-Attack Bases. They stock a wide range of counters, gaming aids and movement trays for multiple game systems, and offer custom items to suit your club, your event, or even your podcast or YouTube channel. Check out the link in the video description.
I won't focus too much on the unboxing side. I've covered that already in the previous video, which I will link if I haven't already done so now. So I do encourage you to go and watch that. I'll talk a little bit more about my thoughts on the miniatures, but I didn't go into great detail because it wasn't really needed, and I'll say it very briefly now. I didn't have any issues with any of the miniatures in this box. They went together very, very well and very easy. The instructions are very good. You've got a couple of different options here on the Astromancers, which I will bring up now because they're the miniatures that I'm going to be painting in this video, but no problems at all, easy to put together, and in my opinion, really, really nice miniatures. Gave the miniatures a black prime once I'd finished building them, and then I'm moving on to a zenithal, which is pretty much my standard way of working, using white through my airbrush, a very thin layer to start with, so I'm almost building up a slightly grey effect all over the miniature, but you can still see all of the black and the dark in the recesses of the miniature. This is for me all about underpainting, building up a grayscale miniature, and then I move back much more top down and at an angle, but though I do turn the miniature all the way around so it's not quite one single light source, which is what zenithal really means, but I'm going for it anyway in this way. Similar treatment for the little onyx chroman familiar, but only with grey rather than white, but just a light dusting over the top and to keep all of that grey in the undercuts as well. Now, the rest of the painting of the little chroman did hit the cutting room floor just to keep the length of the video down, but I will talk about it a little bit at the end, and I don't focus on the mounted version in this video. I'm just going to focus on the foot Astromancer, which is my favourite miniature out of them. Just absolutely love it. What I'm doing here is just giving it a little bit of a dry brush just to really enhance some of the detail on the edges. It's just with white, and I do the same with that little onyx chroman as well, with a little bit of grey, and I'm working very gently in the reverse direction of those feathers, so I'm trying to pick out the detail of the feather without getting any streaking marks on the flat of the body. But like I said, that pretty much is it for the tutorial side of painting the little onyx chroman. These are the same flesh tones I used in the last video, if you looked at the video covering the peasants and the gun teams, and I will put a full list of all the paints that I use up on my Patreon, which is free to view for free Patreon members. However, if you pause the video as I go along, you can also make a note of any paints if you do want to cover it at home and follow along and turn this into a tutorial. I'm going to be chatting a little bit about my thoughts and colour choices and what I'm doing at times, and rabbiting on about other things at other times. So it's definitely a tutorial of type, but a lot of it is also just showing you how I've painted this miniature. So take away what you like from it. I tend to work dark to light with my painting rather than a wash as a first sort of shade, but it does vary a little bit on the skin here, which I'm starting with first. I wanted to do that, and it's again very similar to what I did in the previous video, but just taking a little bit more time, refining it a little bit more on this character miniature. It is a gaming miniature, but it is a character miniature, and I think that the total painting time was around 6 hours for this. So it's not a quick paint job, but it's also not a really long paint job. It's not a competition level paint job, so bear that in mind when you see the processes I'm using and the techniques that I'm using. In many ways it's exactly the same as I use in my tutorials for my rank and file, but I'm just taking that little bit more time to try and be a little bit neater, maybe thinning the paints a little bit more refinement between the layers. But I'm layer painting here, building up from light to dark, making sure that each layer is a little bit thinner than the next, so all the previous layers are showing through, and you get this really nice transition then from the dark to the light on the skin. Now I want to contrast and speed paint. The reason for my underpainting my zenithal, my slapdrop-esque stuff is because I love to base coat in these quick style of paints, even when it's a character miniature, and then working with all of that shadow and highlight that's built in through that underpainting gives you a really nice base layer to work from, which I find easier and more enjoyable to highlight on top afterwards. I decided that I was going to go for this sort of fairly bright orange. The studio paint job has got this wonderful orange which you wouldn't normally place next to a red, but it works so well. I really enjoyed it, so I thought I really wanted to copy that over from the studio paint scheme. So while it's not an exact copy, I like the scheme so much that I'm doing my own version of it. Carrying that same orange over onto the feathers that are on the top of the headdress of his helmet here as well. I'm using Skeleton Horde here as the base for some of the tan colours on his robes. You all have seen this for the peasants as well. It's one of my all-time favourite paints. Absolutely love this, and I use it nearly in every project that I do. So if you don't own a pot, you definitely should. If you use the kind of quick paints, the speed paints, the contrast paints, it's absolutely fantastic. Something you may notice I'm doing is being very careful with the thin layers that I'm putting on. I want enough paint that it creates enough of a shadow in the recesses, working with that underpainting, but I don't want pooling. And if I can take my time with my placement of the paint and make sure this is a nice smooth finish, leaving smooth finishes on the higher areas on the top, but still getting that shadow in the recesses, then I'm happy, and it will save me lots of time later on. I appreciate on camera as well, the miniature can just look white, and that's partly to do with the lighting and the angle that I'm holding the miniature at. You can't see all the shadow in the recesses that Zenithal gives you. And if you've sprayed your miniature white, you'll be able to do something very, very similar, but it really does reinforce the shadows by doing the Zenithal side of things. But I also know not everyone has an airbrush. You can get around that by you may be using a grey spray and a nice even dry brush all over, but I really like using this method. And as I move on to the red, the Blood Angels red in this case is very much more of the same, nice smooth coats, trying to work with what's already there. And if I go back a little bit to talking about that what looks like a white spray there, when contrast paint was first brought out, I didn't even sort of initially start to use it. It was sold or marketed very much as a quick way of painting your armies. Spray your miniature white or off-white grey or off-white cream colour, and then you just whack your paints on, one job. That's all that's done. And it's nice to see how it's developed over the years now, people using it in different ways. And again, the way I find it most useful is to have that good zenithal underpaint layer and have nice controlled smooth coats to start with, because you can really cut down on how much you need to highlight later on. By this stage, I'm really just referencing that studio paint job because I like it so much, and trying to find colours that are close enough so that I've got something that's a nice approximation of it afterwards. And this is Agarash Dunes, which is slightly richer in pigment, more yellow tone than Skeleton Horde, but only slightly. It's still on that same spectrum, and I'm just using it around this wrap that's around his waist where his leather belt sits on top. If you've seen my previous Cathay videos, you'll have seen me using this Talisar blue as well. And one of my favourite contrast paints as well. And again, if you get a nice smooth coat of it, it's so rich and strong in pigment in the recesses, but it's very light and smooth on those raised areas. You can get a really nice finish that doesn't require an awful lot of highlighting afterwards. And if I could be at a stage where I only need to do a subtle edge highlight after I've applied some contrast paint and it looks like I've applied 2 or 3 highlights, then that's a winner for me, even on a character miniature like this. Grim black. Now, there's not an awful lot of black on this miniature, but I'm going for black on his shoes and then also on his little dagger's scabbard as well, and the grip, so it's got some black leather, just a bit of a contrast to the brown. Again, Studio Paint Job has done something very, very similar, and I nearly went with brown because I'm going to be using some brown for the other leathers, but I decided that it was nice to add a little bit more colour in there. There's so many colours in this, with the orange and the blue and the red. Almost feels like it should be too much, but it looks great in the Studio Paint Job, and I'm pretty happy with the way it came out in the end. You have to let me know at the end of the video. Again, referring to that box art paint job, the feathers blend from that orange into a nice teal blue, and I'm using a Caribbean blue contrast paint here as well, so a speed paint in this instance, allowing it to overlap a little bit with the orange, and when I go back and highlight afterwards, it just tidies it all up quite nicely. Again, a consistent favourite of mine is Cygor Brown as a base for many leathers and wood, and for this it's all going to be leather on this miniature, including the staff. I've decided the staff is going to be slightly different to the studio paint job, which is steel. I like the idea that some of the staff is maybe covered in a leather or painted or something like that. But anyway, I'm using it to do all of the leather trim that it shows on the studio paint jobs around the edge of the armor plates at the side here, and the greaves on the arm, and even on the shoulder pads there's some leather sections as well. I think it's like leather covered a metal or something like that. So I'm not too worried about if it overspills where there will be a metallic paint, because the metallic paint will go over it very, very nicely. So I'm being a little bit loose on the inside, allowing it to run into those areas if need be, because it doesn't matter. But it's such a nice, rich, warm brown. It's a lovely base for wood and leathers and things, which I use all the time in nearly all my videos. It's just so versatile, and again, it's one of those paints I would recommend if you're looking for a few must-haves for contrast paints. Then I think Cygor Brown is right up there. I've decided his beard's going to be a greyish white, partly because the underpaint has left a nice grayscale beard anyway. So I'm just toning it down a little bit by gently glazing in some of the white style contrast paint. So it's Holy White in this case. A Apothecary White from Citadel is equally good. With all the base colours down, it's time to start with the metallics, and I'm using a dark bronze again. Very much the same methods as I was using for the troops in the previous video, if you've seen that. It's a really nice base for steel and for gold colours. I use it for steel all the time, and it just provides a really nice dark recessed colour for it. If you cover 80-90% of it in a steel colour, great. So I nearly always start with covering all my metallic areas in a dark metallic brown colour, be the bronze that you can see here or other brands. On this miniature, I'm not painting anything steel at all. All of the metal is going to be a gold, copperish colour, so it's even easier. And again, that's the other good thing about basing with this sort of bronze colour. It's the perfect base as a shadow for your bronzes, your golds, and, like I said, the steel. One of my least favourite things on modern miniatures is when it actually has a slightly raised area of detail like this on capes with really, really thin lines. It's so hard to do a neat job on it. Probably rather not do freehand for this either, but I find it really, really frustrating how long it takes sometimes just to make sure you do a really neat job. So I was just taking my time getting the base colours down. Much like everything else in the way I paint, it's usually dark to light, and I'm just layering on the next colours now. So I'm using a copper colour here. I've talked about this in videos before. Obviously copper isn't gold, and this is a very genuine copper colour as well, but it also works within the gold spectrum, or your eyes will believe it to be a gold if you put it as part of a gold recipe. And very often with paint ranges, you will find that bronzes and coppers and golds have different names in different ranges, different brands, and one might be called a bronze and it might be called a gold from another range. So they are a little bit interchangeable, so don't worry too much about the naming conventions if the colour's right for the job in hand. And like I said, while this is definitely copper-esque, the next layers are going to be much more traditional, brighter golds, and this works quite well as part of the sort of the group of colours that I'm using together. Next up we have this rich gold, and it really is quite a bright rich gold, and it would have been too much of a jump to go from that dark bronze straight to this. I just found using that copper colour in between has given it a little bit of a platform for it, which makes it a little bit more believable. And each time I'm adding a colour here, I'm adding a little bit less in terms of paint on the miniature, so that you've got those previous colours showing through, and I'm focusing more and more on where the light would hit, especially when it's a metallic paint like this, because you will really want to build that kind of shine in there, that realism, that feeling that the light is catching on something quite regal, quite expensive here. And by the time I get to this top highlight, the bright gold, it's really just a little dots here or there, or the very, very top highlights. And I've got that nice transition all the way through from that dark bronze, that sort of orangey copper colour, and then these two brighter golds at the end to finish it all off. And I think it works quite nicely. It's warm enough so it doesn't sort of conflict too much with the oranges and reds, and the blue there just sort of balances it out a little bit. This is boar hide and fur cloak from Two Thin Coats, and those of you who have watched a lot of my videos will know I use these all the time as highlights over Cygor brown contrast paint. They are just fantastic for it as well, and there'll be versions in other paint ranges. If you use their conversion charts, you'll be able to find them in the Citadel ranges as well, but they're just really nice. So I'm just working around the miniature at this stage, filling in and brightening up all of the leather, leaving the darkest shade in there as well. So using that Cygor brown and leaving it right into those dark recesses, some of that showing, just lightening all over with the boar hide and then leaving that fur cloak as the top highlight. There's not a lot of blue on the miniature, but I'll be using the same crystal blue that I did in the first video, but I'm adding a little bit of that lighter shade of blue as well in the final highlights because it's a character miniature and I want to add a little bit more brightness. And it's a 50-50 mix of those two paints for the top highlight, but I really am just using the light that's already showing there from the way the Talassar blue has reacted or worked with the underpainting. So in most cases I'm just running the edge of my brush down the edge of those little tassels there, so you've got a nice neat line, and then following back up with a thin layer of the 50-50 mix. To highlight the inside of that bright orange cloak, I wanted to make it a touch desaturated. I think otherwise it would clash too much with the red, so I'm using a little bit of orange there, but mixing a little bit of a tan colour in. It's the same tan colour as well that I've used or going to be using to highlight over the skeleton horde, so it brings those colours together, and I think that really helps as well to tie a paint scheme together. So I start with just a little bit of the orange and I'm just slowly mixing more of that tan in, and then just a few edge highlights and things on the end as well, so you get this nice subtle transition all the way from the darker orange to the lighter sort of tan as well, and it works quite well in my opinion. And then what I so often do is return with the contrast paint or the speed paint with a little bit on the wet palette to thin it and just paint it back into the recesses and blend and glaze it over to smooth it out in places as well. It just really tidies it up, adds a little bit more punch and depth to the shadows, and just finishes it off really quite nicely. And like I said, continuing with that tan colour vampire fang in this case to highlight the main part of the cloak that you can see, and also the little bit at the front as well. And what I don't want to do is paint over the whole of that area. I've got a bit of shadow from the contrast paint, the skeleton horde that's gone on there, so I want to work with that and the underpainting. So I'm doing all my strokes in the same direction here, so it's the flow of the cloak. Thin paint, but not so thin and it's watery and everywhere, and just sort of slowly building the lighter areas up and trying to leave the recesses as much as possible. And what that does is it just slowly gives you this transition without you having some kind of messy, muddy mess that you have to kind of start almost all over again. There's a few other areas like the sleeves where that same colour is needed as well, and they're much easier to highlight, so you can focus very much on the top of the folds of the clothing. It's only on those flatter areas you really have to think about your brush strokes, the direction you put your brush in, and how much of what you've already painted you want to cover, so you don't want to end up repainting the whole thing again. It's just working with those highlights that are there and trying to blend them and feather them in nicely to the darker areas. And it's this next stage with this off-white, trooper white in this case, that really finishes it off. Just some really nice, neat top highlights along the edges of some of the folds or on the far edges of certain areas here. Really just neatens it up, makes it pop a little bit more, and makes a lot of sense with what you were just doing, or what I was just doing with the vampire fang there. And it just really, for me, tidies it up, finishes it off, and you get a really nice sort of punchy transition between those darkest shades and the nice top highlights. There was that area that I used Agoraz Dunes for, the slightly yellower version of an off-white colour around the belt area, and so I'm just using a slightly different colour to highlight there. There's a base coat is ambush yellow, and I'm just adding a little bit of white to it as well for those top highlights. There's not an awful lot to do here, focusing very much on the top of the folds of the clothing and much smaller dots when it comes to the white, so you get this sort of nice 3 to 4 stage transition. Here's a selection of reds that I'm using. It's 4 of these 6 paints from the flexible triad from the cool reds, and again just working my way up from dark to light. Because there's such large areas of the cloak, I'm using a stage lower as my base than I did for the standard troops in the previous video, but again not an awful lot of that. I've got the paint very thin here, much thinner than I did for when I was painting the peasants, because I want this to be a slightly smoother transition. I'm still doing basic layering. I'm essentially layering up, focusing on the top folds of the clothing, working with the detail on the miniature rather than against it, and hoping that some of the shadow that's already built in through that contrast layer will do some of the work there as well. By the time I'm getting to those top layers, those almost pinky tones, I'm very much just adding a little bit of an edge highlight here and there, some very faint highlight lines, almost edge highlight style on some of the top folds there, just to really make it pop. And I'm focusing on making it much brighter towards the bottom of the clothing there, so it really stands out. A little bit of highlighting on those feathers now. So we have marine mist, which is almost white, a real sort of minty blue colour. Just works really nicely just to paint in a few of the edges of some of the feathers. For the orange feathers, I used the same methods as I did for the inside of that cloak a little bit earlier on. For the few areas of black on the boots, there's very little showing, but I've got a deep grey here, more of a mid-tone, and with the grim black speed paint, it really looks very grey on those raised areas. It works very nicely for running into the recesses. I'm really just kind of painting in where those lighter areas are and tidying them up, following on with a much lighter grey, ash grey in this instance, just to add a little bit of edge highlight on that top side of the scab and a couple of the marks of the grip on the handle as well. This is almost a white metallic paint. It's one of the top highlights from one of the true metallic sets from Vallejo at the moment, and I'm using it for some underpainting. I'm painting in little dots and lines of where there will be kind of a jeweled area on the miniature, so it'll make more sense in a moment. And you can see I've got the onyx chromium because I used it on him as well, but those three colours, speed paints, I'm using to paint in just a couple of these stones that are on the headdress and on the waist, or on the chest rather, of the miniature. I'm using some oil wash here as well. Again, I'll talk about it a little bit more in that first video tutorial, but I tend to use oil washes instead of standard washes these days. So I'm using an old brush just to apply it just over the metallic areas, just in the gold. It runs into the recesses and dries in a really sort of pleasing way. And then the really good thing about it is you can use a little bit of artist white spirit just to take it back off the flat surfaces, and you'll see me do that in this kind of next clip here. And you want to use old paintbrushes when you're doing this, and you want to try and keep it on your metallic paints if you've not used oil paints before, but it's definitely worth giving them a go. The beauty of them is that you can take them back off again and you don't end up with that horrible tide marks that you can get using a standard wash. You can see here I'm just sort of making it a little bit shinier, removing it from the flat surfaces on the top of those shoulder pads. Really makes a difference and makes that gold really pop and stand out a lot more while leaving everything in the recesses. I like to add a little bit of realism to my painting, so I'm using a little bit of mud effect here that I've already applied to the base in certain areas, and just a few splatters on the bottom of the cloak. He does look pretty grand and shiny, but he's also in a battle, and I like him to look like he's in a battle. But after that, it's the final stage, adding a little bit of a tidy up with the painting of the rim of the base, and they're both done. And apologies for not covering the onyx chromium as well, but it would just almost double the time of the video. Not quite, but added a bit more. Now, I'm really happy the way these guys come out. For the amount of time that it took, I could have refined things an awful lot more, but it's a step up from the sort of standard rank and file as well. I absolutely love this miniature. I think it's a stunning sculpt, and it was a real joy to paint. One of my favourite miniatures, I'm sure, from the new things that they've released for Warhammer, the Old World. Really cool. I absolutely love it. A little bit more about that little onyx chromium familiar. I think what I cut out would have added about 15 minutes to the video, and that's probably just a little bit too much for a video of this kind. Sort of 25 to half an hour is about the limit, really, so my apologies. I may well cover it separately at another time in the future if there's enough interest, but as I said, I've painted them already, so I need a second one. But in brief, you saw me doing the initial stage with the airbrush, and then that very subtle dry brush picking out the feathers. Then after that, it was all glazes, and I will include those colours in the photo that's over on the Patreon. You might know where I've used them, you might be able to guess. I've used purples and pink and the blue that you saw me hold up near the onyx chrome a little bit earlier on, and I've used that on the bauble as well, and then done a gloss varnish over the top. I've just glazed them very thinly into different areas all over the miniature. The metallics are all the same metallics that are used on the same Astromancer, and I've used a little bit of yellowish contrast paint on the edge of the beak as well. I know it's a crow, I know it would all be black, but I want this to look slightly different, maybe have something to do with Zinch. I quite like the idea of getting the blues, the purples and the pinks in there for glazes. The brown, the leather is done the same way as I did on the Astromancer as well, so it's really a matter of glazing in those contrasts, or those speed paints in this instance, over the different areas of the flesh, still showing up all of that detail that was there before. And the same on the little sort of tabard that hangs down the front of him as well. Started with the purple at the top, wet blended to the pink, and then to the turquoise blue, and those are the same colours, as I said, that I used on that sort of little ball, and then also used on the jewel that's on the headdress and on the jewel around the neck of the Astromancer as well. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and the other content that I've done for this new Cathay release. I've had loads of fun painting the new miniatures. I personally think they're absolutely fantastic, and this Astromancer model is one of the best new miniatures they've released for the game, in my opinion. I absolutely love it, and I will be using it in lots of games. And when I'm not playing Cathay, I'm sure he may turn up as an Outcast Wizard or an alternative Empire Wizard at times. I just really enjoy the sculpt, and I had so much fun painting it. So let me know what you think in the comments below of the miniature. Let me know if you're picking up these sets yourself, have pre-ordered them, or you plan to pick them up individually when they come out. If you're still watching at this stage, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. I've got loads more Warhammer the Old World content on its way soon. In fact, there will be loads more going forward. It is my favourite game. I am absolutely in love with it, but there is also lots of other stuff on the channel to check out as well. Loads of other game systems. I'm a wargamer of many different flavours, so go and have a look if you are new to the channel. If you like what you've seen and like to support me even further, please do check out my Patreon. There's a link in the video description, and thank you as always to all my existing patrons. I couldn't do what I do without you. You really help keep the lights on. Also check out the channel sponsor Counterattack Bases. They do loads and loads of counters and gaming aids, loads for Warhammer the Old World, and they do custom dice as well. So thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.